Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The winter storm had already been battering the prairie for 2 days when Elias Ward pushed his horse forward through another deep snowdrift. His coat, heavy with frozen wind, pulled at his shoulders, and the cold bit into his face with each breath. Elias had been out checking the far fence line because the north rail had collapsed the week before, and he wanted to make sure the storm hadn't torn down more of his land. He didn't enjoy being out here, but he had learned long ago that a rancher who ignores his fences loses cattle, and he couldn't afford another loss. Not after the years he'd spent trying to rebuild a life that once belonged to someone else. Elias was 40, lean from long days working alone, his movements controlled and quiet. He had buried his wife, Miriam, almost 7 years earlier after she grew ill during a harsh winter much like this one. Since then, silence had become a constant companion. The cabin they had shared still held her sewing basket, her folded quilt, the kettle she always cleaned twice even when it wasn't needed. Elias kept everything in place because changing anything felt like erasing her too quickly. Today, however, he wasn't thinking about the past. He was focused on the storm and the growing concern that his horse might stumble again. He gripped the reins tightly and leaned forward, eyes narrowed against the blowing snow. A part of him wanted to turn back, but he forced himself to continue. The fence mattered, and the work gave him something steady when memories became too loud. His horse suddenly stopped. Elias felt the shift in the animal's body, as stiffening a slight tremor. He looked ahead, scanning the white haze. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed two dark shapes near a cluster of wind-beaten pines. They were half buried in the snow, motionless. His heartbeat quickened. Shapes like that could be anything: dead livestock, broken logs, or something far worse. For a moment, Elias hesitated. He had found bodies before, wanderers caught in storms, men who'd pushed their luck too far. He didn't want to face another scene like that, but ignoring it would leave him with a guilt he didn't want to carry. So he nudged his horse forward. As he approached, the shapes became clearer. Two people lying close together, their limbs stiff, their clothing frosted solid. He slid off the saddle and hurried toward them, snow crunching beneath his boots. When he knelt beside the nearest figure, he saw the woman's face, young, Apache, her eyelashes frozen shut. He placed a gloved hand near her mouth. A faint breath touched his palm. Alive. Elias felt a sharp jolt of alarm. Saving one unconscious person in this storm was difficult. Saving two felt nearly impossible. But he also knew he had no choice. Leaving them meant their deaths, and he couldn't carry something like that on his conscience. He checked the second woman. She was breathing too, though weaker. The two looked nearly identical. Same bone structure, same long dark hair, stiffened with ice, same age. Twins. Elias took a steadying breath, his mind racing. Can I get them onto the horse without hurting them more? Can the horse carry 3? Will we make it before the weather worsens? He felt fear rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. He told himself the same thing he always said when a decision pressed him too hard. Do the next thing, just the next thing. He lifted the first sister gently, surprised at how light she felt. Her body was rigid from the cold, and he moved slowly to avoid breaking fragile limbs. He settled her across the horse, securing her with his arm while trying not to startle the already anxious animal. Then he returned for the second sister, lifting her with equal care. She stirred faintly, her eyes opening a sliver, but she couldn't speak. Stay with me, Elias murmured, unsure whether she heard him. With both women secured, he mounted behind them and guided the horse toward home. The wind hit them harder on the open stretch, and Elias leaned forward to shield the sisters from the worst of it. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. They were strangers. He didn't know their story, their tribe, or what danger they had fled. But he knew they were human beings who would die if he wasted a second. His cabin appeared through the storm like a dark block rising from the snow. Relief struck him so quickly that he exhaled, shoulders sagging for a moment. He hurried the horse forward, stopped at the door, and carried each woman inside. The warmth of the cabin was minimal, just a small fire and a faint heat from the stones. Elias closed the door, locked it, and quickly set to work. He laid the sisters near the fire, wrapped them in blankets, and heated water for broth. As he tended to them, he felt his hands shaking, not from cold, but from the pressure of the situation. If they don't warm up soon, I may lose them anyway. I can't let that happen now. Not after finding them. The sisters' breathing stabilized slowly. Their eyes flickered open at different moments, both filled with fear and confusion. Elias spoke in a calm, steady voice, explaining where they were, that they were safe, and that the storm would pass. He didn't touch them more than necessary, noticing how their bodies tensed from instinctive caution. As hours passed, their condition improved enough that they drifted into natural sleep rather than unconsciousness. Elias remained beside the fire, leaning against the wall, watching them with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet responsibility. He didn't know why the prairie had placed two strangers in his path today. He didn't know how their presence would alter the rhythm of his isolated life. He only knew one thing clearly. He had brought them home, and now he had to keep them alive. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence in the cabin shift, just slightly, towards something that didn't feel like loneliness anymore. The storm pushed hard against the cabin walls through the night, rattling the windows and filling every gap with a low, steady hum. Elias stayed awake beside the fire, adding wood when the flames dropped too low and checking the sisters' breathing whenever their blankets shifted. Their faces had regained a small amount of color, and the stiffness in their fingers had eased, but the cold had left them drained. Elias watched them closely, trying to judge how much strength they had left. He knew any mistake could set back their recovery. By early morning, the sisters stirred more naturally. The firelight revealed their features clearly for the first time. High cheekbones, long dark hair thawed into tangled waves, matching eyes that opened slowly as if afraid of what they might see. The older of the two, at least by the steadiness in her gaze, tried to sit up but winced sharply, clutching her ribs. Elias moved closer, careful not to startle her. "Easy. You're safe. The cold's still in you," he said in a quiet tone. She watched him for a long moment before nodding once. Her sister woke moments later, blinking rapidly as she tried to understand the room. She reached toward the older woman, who took her hand immediately. Their connection was silent but strong. Elias realized they didn't know who he was or why he had helped them. To calm any confusion, he spoke in the same steady voice. "My name is Elias Ward. This is my home. I brought you here last night. You were close to freezing." The sisters listened without interrupting. The younger one's breathing grew tight, as if she expected danger to follow them into the cabin. Elias noticed this and shifted back a step to give them more space. He placed a pot of warm broth near them and gestured that they could take it when ready. Hunger was clear from the sharp way the younger sister glanced toward the pot, though she kept her posture guarded. Elias understood the hesitation and waited without pressure. After a few minutes, the older sister reached for the bowl. Her hands trembled, but she held the broth carefully, sipping slowly while watching Elias with deliberate caution. When she finished, she nodded toward her sister, allowing her to drink as well. The younger one obeyed, her shoulders relaxing slightly with the first real warmth she had felt in days. Elias didn't ask questions yet. Their faces already told enough: fear, exhaustion, and a deep uncertainty about what would come next. But he needed to understand their injuries. The cold had been severe, and there was a limit to what blankets and broth could fix. "Can you move your fingers?" "Your toes," he asked calmly. They tested their hands without speaking at first. Their movements were slow but responsive. Elias watched carefully, gauging their progress. The younger sister's left ankle seemed swollen beneath the blanket, so he crouched near it, showing her his hands before reaching gently. She tensed, gripping her sister's wrist, but didn't pull away. When he pressed lightly around the joint, she let out a sharp breath, signaling pain but not unbearable damage. "It'll heal," Elias said. "Just keep it wrapped and warm." They exchanged a glance, as if confirming that his intentions remained steady. Their expressions held both fear and gratitude, mixed in a way that came from people who had survived more than cold. As the morning passed, the small cabin filled with simple sounds: crackling fire, shifting blankets, Elias's steady footsteps as he checked supplies. The sisters' eyes followed him, not with suspicion now, but with curiosity. They were trying to understand the man who had brought them back from the edge of death. Elias, aware of their attention, kept his movements measured and quiet. He didn't want to overwhelm them. Eventually, the older sister looked toward the window where snow still pressed against the glass. Her brows tightened, and a faint shake of her head revealed a question Elias had already anticipated: how far they were from danger, and whether the threat they escaped could still reach them. "You're deep in the prairie. No one comes this far without a reason," Elias said, sensing the fear behind her expression. "Whatever happened out there isn't going to reach this place tonight." Her eyes lowered, as if weighing the truth of his words. The younger sister let out a breath she had been holding since waking. Elias continued tending the room, but his thoughts circled around the same concern. They weren't just lost travelers. Something had driven them into the storm. Something had left them to die. Until they chose to speak, he needed to keep them safe without pressing them too hard. He noticed another detail he had overlooked in the rush of rescue. Their clothing, though torn and frostburned, carried beadwork and patterns that matched. Their hair had been braided similarly before the cold had ruined the shape. Their movements mirrored one another. They were not only sisters, they were twins, bonded by something deeper than appearance. The older sister finally spoke, her voice low and rough from cold. "How long were we asleep?" "A few hours," Elias answered. "Long enough to breathe steady again." She nodded, then asked the next question carefully. "You live here alone?" "Yes." The younger sister studied him, likely trying to understand why a solitary rancher would risk himself in a storm to save two strangers. Elias didn't explain the decision outright, but the truth settled inside him quietly. He did it because walking away would have stayed with him for the rest of his life. When the fire grew low, he added another log. The sisters watched the flame rise, both leaning slightly toward the warmth. Their bodies relaxed in small, cautious increments. Outside, the storm continued without pause. Inside, the three of them settled into an uneasy but growing sense of safety. Nothing between them was clear yet. Not their past, not their future, not the reason fate had drawn their paths together. But Elias knew the next steps would matter. Their recovery, their trust, and whatever drove them into the snow would shape everything that came after. And with the storm sealing them inside the cabin, they had no choice but to face it together. The wind weakened by late afternoon, leaving the cabin wrapped in a heavy silence broken only by the settling of snow on the roof. Elias placed another pot on the stove, letting vegetables soften slowly while he cleaned the melted puddles near the door. The sisters rested with their backs against the wall, wrapped in blankets, their eyes following every movement in the room. Their breathing had grown steadier, but exhaustion still clung to them. When Elias finished his chores, he pulled a stool near the fire but left enough distance so they wouldn't feel crowded. He sensed they were gathering the strength to speak. Their earlier fear had softened into something quieter but still guarded. They exchanged a look, one twin silently encouraging the other to begin. The older sister lifted her chin slightly. "I am Naira," she said, her voice rough but steady. She nodded toward the younger woman beside her. "She is Talia." Elias acknowledged them with a small nod. He waited, allowing them to choose what came next. Naira continued. "We should tell you how we came to the snow. You need to know why we were alone." Talia pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, as if bracing herself. Her ankles still throbbed beneath the wrap, but her expression showed a deeper wound, one that had nothing to do with the cold. Naira took a careful breath. "Our band was moving toward the southern ridge. We traveled light because we thought the path was safe. It wasn't. Raiders came before dawn. They broke our camp, scattered our people, took what they could, and left many wounded." She paused, eyes lowering. "They left us behind. We were separated from the others. We tried to follow their tracks, but the storm swallowed everything." Talia nodded, adding quietly, "We walked until we couldn't walk anymore. We thought the cold would finish what the raiders started." The truth of their situation settled heavily in the room. Elias felt a tight ache in his chest, not only because of what they had endured, but because he understood the weight of being abandoned. Their voices carried the same quiet strain he had once heard in his own breath after losing his wife. He studied their faces carefully, noticing the resilience beneath the exhaustion. Naira continued, her voice tightening. We don't know who survived. We don't know who escaped. We only know we had no place to go except forward. She looked at Elias directly. Then we saw your shadow through the snow. Elias shifted on the stool, absorbing their words. Their injuries, their fear, their exhaustion, it all made sense now. The storm hadn't been their only enemy. They had been fighting long before he found them. He felt himself weigh each detail, trying to understand the scale of what the sisters had lost and what dangers might still follow. Talia spoke again, this time more firmly. You brought us here when no one else would have seen us. She wasn't offering thanks. She was stating a fact, something she had accepted quietly during the hours of recovery. Elias didn't respond immediately. His throat tightened with a mixture of responsibility and unease. He didn't want praise, but he couldn't deny that he had been the only person in a wide stretch of land who might have noticed them before the snow buried them completely. He cleared his throat and asked the question that had lingered since the moment he carried them inside. Did the raiders follow your tracks? Naira shook her head slowly. We don't think so. The storm erased everything far behind us. If they pushed north, they wouldn't know where we went. Talia looked to the window, where daylight was fading. But men like them don't stop. If they want something, they chase it. Her voice carried steady realism, not panic. Elias followed her gaze. The land outside was quiet, but he knew danger didn't always announce itself. He had seen enough conflict on the frontier to understand that fear wasn't weakness, it was awareness. He stood and fetched clean cloth from a small cabinet. I'll need to check the swelling again, he said, nodding toward Talia's ankle. She allowed it without hesitation this time. The earlier tension she felt around him had eased, replaced by the simple acceptance that she needed his help. Elias unwrapped the band gently, examining the joint. The swelling had lessened, but the skin was bruised. She winced but didn't pull away. It'll heal, Elias said. You'll be walking without trouble in a few days. Talia gave a faint nod, resting her head against the wall. When Elias finished, he returned the cloths and stirred the pot on the stove. The warm scent of vegetables and broth filled the cabin. Naira watched him with quiet attention. We had food for 2 days before the attack, she said softly. After that, nothing. Elias ladled steaming broth into wooden bowls and set them within reach. You'll get strength back soon, he said. Storm or not, there's food here. They ate slowly, savoring each bite. Their shoulders loosened, their posture shifting from defensive to something closer to relief. Talia let out the smallest breath of comfort, barely audible but clear enough for Elias to catch. When they finished their meal, Naira placed her bowl aside and spoke with more certainty than before. We are alive because you stopped your horse yesterday. That is something our people don't ignore. Elias felt the weight of her statement, but didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded, unsure of what meaning she placed behind the words. The fire crackled steadily as night settled around the cabin. For the first time since arriving, the sisters looked like they believed they might see another morning. Elias checked the door latch one last time, then extinguished the lantern near the window. As he sat back down near the fire, he glanced at the two women leaning against the wall, wrapped together in shared warmth and shared survival. There were still many things unclear: how long they would stay, what danger might follow, and what role he would play in the days ahead. But in this moment, with the storm easing and their breathing deep and steady, the cabin no longer felt like a place reserved only for memory. It felt like a place where 3 lives had begun to move toward something new. Night passed without interruption, and by morning the storm had weakened into a slow, drifting snow that moved gently across the prairie. The cabin was cold despite the fire's steady effort, so Elias rose early to heat the stove again. He worked quietly, trying not to disturb the sisters, but both were already awake, watchful, alert, and still adjusting to a room that belonged to someone they did not yet understand. Naira attempted to stand, using the wall for balance. She moved with care, testing her muscles as if they might fail beneath her. Talia remained seated, lifting her injured ankle slightly to avoid pressure. Elias stepped toward them with measured calm. "You should take it slow," he said. "Your bodies need time." Naira gave a small nod. There was determination in her movements, not recklessness, as if she believed regaining her strength was the first step to reclaiming control of the life she had nearly lost. Elias pulled the old quilt from the cot and handed it to them. It had belonged to Miriam, sewn in the early years of their marriage, kept clean and folded even after her passing. He hesitated before offering it, wondering if he was crossing some invisible boundary in his own grief. But the sisters accepted it without question, draping it around their shoulders as naturally as if it were meant to be used again. Talia's eyes lingered on the pattern, a simple arrangement of squares, stitched carefully but unevenly in places. She traced one of the seams with her finger. "Someone worked hard on this," she said quietly. Elias nodded, swallowing the emotion that rose in his throat. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The quilt carried a history that he had never shared with anyone, but handing it to the sisters didn't feel wrong. It felt necessary. As the morning settled in, Naira insisted on helping with small tasks. She used the broom to clear melted snow and ash from the floor, while Talia folded blankets and arranged them near the fire. Their movements were slow, but growing steadier. Elias watched them closely, trying to understand how two people who had nearly died could focus so quickly on restoring some sense of order. He realized slowly that they needed structure as much as warmth. It grounded them. While they worked, Elias checked the door frame and the gaps along the walls. The storm had pushed snow into crevices, and he stuffed them tightly with cloth. Talia observed him for a long time before speaking. "You've lived here many years," she said. "You know how to survive winters like this." Elias nodded, long enough to know when to prepare and when to wait. Naira paused her sweeping, studying him. "Do you always stay alone?" He tightened the cloth in his hands. The question wasn't meant to pry. It was simple curiosity, maybe even concern, but it touched a part of him he rarely spoke about. He straightened the blanket along the door and answered with quiet honesty. "I had a wife. She passed. Since then, I live here." Naira's expression softened with understanding. Talia lowered her gaze with the same quiet respect she had shown the quilt. They didn't offer sympathy or hollow words, which Elias appreciated. They simply accepted the truth and moved on. He finished his repairs and sat by the fire with a cup of warm tea. The sisters joined him, settling opposite him with the quilt shared over their laps. Naira placed her hands close to the flames, warming them steadily. Talia tucked her injured ankle beside her, easing pressure on the joint. Elias watched their faces carefully, sensing another layer of unspoken questions behind their silence. The fear they had shown on the first night was no longer sharp, but something else remained. An uncertainty about whether they were imposing, whether they belonged, whether they should prepare to leave once their bodies healed. Before they had the chance to ask anything, Elias addressed what had been quietly hanging between them. "You don't need to worry about staying here. You're safe until you're strong enough to decide what comes next." Talia looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and relief. Naira's shoulders lowered slightly, tension easing out of her posture. "We didn't know if we would be a burden," Naira admitted. "You gave us shelter. We didn't want to take more." Elias shook